Susanna,
I think that's it.
who's the spring chicken you have next to you?
He ages well, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All that healthy living.
Well, I'm not sure
We are.
what's going on with Facebook here. I thought it seems to be. Hang on. I don't know. It's not coming up on my iPad. It's saying the camera's not supported, but it's working on Zoom.
And then
So
on Facebook.
yeah, we'll press on and see if anybody complains and can give me some help. Oh, and also more people to come in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, the name Maggie Sadaway is familiar. But from
Oh yeah, Donna, you know Maggie.
Of course it is.
no, I'm sorry. I know the name, but I can't think who. And we have another, because we have 3 people so far whose names I don't know at all. So you see how out of it I am.
Maggie and
Hey,
I met-
Wendy.
Hey.
Wendy's coming. Hey.
Yeah, I'm trying my best. It's gonna be fair since I get to see you, right? Can you hear me?
There's Wendy.
Louie, hi. Wow. Wow, this is great. So many good old friends.
It was a
Wow.
great idea.
Well, Aaron reminded me this would have slipped through. I'm so happy Aaron told me, hey, and Susanna.
We can give Aaron the credit, and then I followed.
So hard to believe, he would have been 100 today. I mean, on Friday, but time flies, right? Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. We'll get started, and I want to thank you for coming to John's 100th birthday celebration. And I look forward to your thoughts, memories, and discussion of John's life and work, and to reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. When I started work with John Holt in 1981, it was clear to me that Holt Associates and the magazine it published, Growing Without Schooling, existed in a unique space, the borderlands between back to the land hippies and evangelical churches, all between alternative schools and conventional schools. And navigating those borders has never been easy. But John's work shows us another way to think about teaching and learning that goes beyond measuring time spent in a classroom and test scores. I want to start this commemoration of John's birthday by reading an excerpt from a very revealing and long letter he wrote to a friend and my colleague, Susanna Sheffer, and she reproduced it in her fantastic collection of John's letters, A Life Worth Living. So this is a letter from 1980. John had been publishing GWS for about 5 years then. And he writes, "What keeps me sane, though some might disagree." Oh, okay, I am recording this, good. "What keeps me sane, though some might disagree, busy and mostly happy in spite of all this, is that I never did and do not now define myself exclusively or primarily as an educator. I am interested in human growth and learning, but only as part of the larger interest in society. Perhaps my deepest interest could be described as how can we adults work to create a more decent, humane, conserving, peaceful, just, etc. community, nation, world? And how can we make it possible for children to join us in this work? How can we take down the many barriers we have put up between the young and their elders? Except insofar as we find answers to those questions, there is very little we can do under the name of education to help young people grow up into whole, intelligent, sensitive, resourceful, competent human beings. This is not the old argument that we must reform society before we can do anything about education. It is to say that the only way young people can grow up well is by having constant and free access to adults who are working to make a decent society. Unless we have a sense of mission, the children will not have one. But our mission can't simply be children. At least mine can't. To spend all of one's time and energy thinking about how best to deal with children does not seem to me like serious work for a grown-up. Which is to say that the presence of an army of child specialists would probably be bad for children, no matter what this particular army believed. I think that children need to live a considerable part of their lives free of the influence of adults and out from under their eyes, and that in another large part of their lives, they should have as much access as they want to adults who are busy about their adult affairs. I have seen over and over again how children love to hang about at the edges of serious adult talk, perhaps only understanding a little of it, but intuiting that it is that it is serious and stands for the world that they themselves are entering into. They get none of this in school, and almost by definition, they can't. A school is a place that exists only to take care of kids, and as such, is more likely than not to be more bad than good for kids, no matter who is running it, and even if you and or I were running it. This thread of helping young people find work worth doing in the world and helping them to find and join with adults who are doing that sort of work is something that will run more and more through GWS as time goes on. I was enormously encouraged to read in the New York Times only a few days ago that in the last year or two, the number of small farms in New England, which have been declining for years, had risen sharply. We are learning once again to produce our own food, and this can only be a good sign. And many of these small farms would and do welcome young people as workers and apprentices. The big picture in the US is discouraging. There are large and visible signs everywhere of a society in a state of collapse. For 30 years or so, ever since I first understood more or less what fascism was about, I have felt that we were ready for it. That it would only take the right combination of circumstances and leadership to tip us in that direction. This seems to be truer now than ever. At the same time, there are hundreds of very encouraging small pictures. On a small and local scale, Americans are doing a great many interesting, constructive, significant things, building a new and very different society under the shadow of the old. It is with this work and these people that I identify myself. Do we have time? Useless to ask the question. All we can do is work, hope for the best, and take care not to neglect our pleasures and joys. In my case, mostly music.
So presentient.
Any thoughts or comments that anyone wants to make about this letter or John and his work or your relationship with him? Please just join in. As the spirit moves you, as Peter would say.
Well, I, as a homeschooler with a young child, sorry, my camera's not on. I'm Sue Zimmer. I'm over here. And
Okay.
I was really surprised to hear him saying that adults, or maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I really liked it, that he said that adults, children shouldn't be your only work, you know? And so often in the homeschool community, it seems like nowadays, many women, the children is their only work. That's all they are doing. Like they're having whole careers around their children, blogs and all that. So that was really interesting to me to hear. And I really agreed with that, you know, because I'm a homeschooling mom, but I work, which is really unusual. So that was really nice to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on that same thread, right, I was in the same situation like 27 years ago. I was working, I was going to school, and I was unschooling, and I thought I was the only person doing that until Growing Without Schooling came into the mailbox. And I've shared this with Pat, you know, when it came into the mailbox, it was like I could breathe. I literally just felt, oh my gosh, there were others, right? There were others. And that was so wonderful. And just, it literally made me feel like I can breathe. So he's made such an influence on my life as a parent, but also my work as a researcher. And I'm so thankful to him always, and for Pat and Susanna and everyone who was involved in keeping his legacy alive.
Well, I thought about John this morning when I got up and did my usual scanning of the New York Times and came across the article, quote, "Kids can't read," unquote. The revolt that is taking on the education establishment. And all I could imagine as reading this article was, had John been around to read it, he'd be shaking his head and saying, "Here we go again." They're talking about the science of reading and how all of these progressives who've reduced the role of teaching phonics have caused the generation to not be able to read. And I won't go on to it, but it's just like, I think he'd be really, really discouraged that we have not made significant progress. There's still a lot of wonderful, there are still a few wonderful programs out there and individuals who are behaving in a way that he would support. And they are still so far out the paradigm and the norm. And in fact, the system is continuing to go, in my view, and I think in his, in the opposite direction.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I read that article too, Peter, and I had exactly the same reaction. I remember when the whole controversy started in the early 80s about whole language, as it was called back then.
Right. Right.
And John, what was it, phonics and reading. You have to have a rich, look and see sort of environment too, and hear environment, but you can't neglect phonics. That's always been part of it. And I don't know why we always have to have this, everyone must learn this way, attitude when it comes to learning. But it's so clear that, children have been learning this way, by having people read to them and explain how the sounds are made for centuries. And yet here we are with all this AI and everything else, and we can't even agree on how to teach kids to read, holding them captive for 12 years.
Yeah. Well, as long as, not to get into a sermon here, but, the purpose of conventional schooling, in my never to be humble opinion, is merely to perpetuate the existing dominator culture.
Mhm.
And it shouldn't come as any great surprise that every time a threat to that comes up and something that represents what he described in the letter that you just read as a different way of viewing the world, the dominators attack and eat it up. But we keep coming back.
One of the things that I think is really important about John's work is that teaching that children need opportunities for risk. That by following their parents around and living life with their parents and being allowed to participate in it, they may not be as sheltered as this little K through 12 box that we have made called public school. But that risk is so inherent in all primitive societies' ways of raising children. And, it makes sense to me that there's so many back to the earth type people that are interested in homeschooling because, the K through 12 model is such a big disconnect. And then the other thing I want to say about John that I loved, because I did work in the office when Susanna and Donna and Patrick were there. I was there for a while before John passed. I loved the mess in his office. I think creative people have the biggest messes, and John did. John did. And I just love it. Kind of nice. validation for having a little room and space in your life to really live the way you want to live. And he knew where everything was.
Well,
Maybe. That gives
Yeah,
me-
he lost checks. He lost checks. We would go through those things looking for checks that had never been deposited. And
It's very hopeful though, Wendy. You give me hope to carry on.
That's right.
I wanted to speak to, you know, what Peter's comment about, well, we keep coming back. And, you know, the whole time you were reading the letter, Pat, and it's, you know, it's from a long time ago, and Aaron and I are partly ruefully listening to it and going, well, at least that didn't happen, said sarcastically, all these things that, you know, have not
Right.
gotten better. And John could see, you know, all that. So there's all of that, but John's way of how you live in the midst of all that is so relevant. And I'll just say quickly, I was just not long ago having a correspondence with a good friend who thinks about these kinds of issues, is actually living outside the US for some of the reasons people do nowadays. But I have gotten involved in a whole lot of things that these days that seem to people like they're really painful and hard. And one of this friend was saying to me, how do you do it? Like, why are you not burned out? And I said something, I mean, I'll just summarize it, the John thing. I said, well, it's early Holt influence, you know, just sort of how to live in the midst of things being hard, how to find the pleasures, also the whole nickel and dime theory that we all know. You know, I said, I'm not trying to yell at people or convince people of things, you know, so all of that. And when I ended up talking about, you know, when I said to this correspondent that the things I do, I actually get a lot of pleasure out of, which is what I thought of when you read that beautiful part of John's letter. And my friend laughingly said, I guess, oh, you're a hedonist. And it's not that though, right? Like, that's not what it is.
Yeah.
It's finding the pleasure. And John was such an early influence in that.
yeah.
I
Wendy, you brought your son with you a lot to the office. As I
Yeah.
brought my child to the office, and we had a lot of that kind of thing going on. Can you just tell me, where is he now? What is he doing? I mean, let's hope he's not in prison or something horrible, but
No. He started wanting to cook when he was like 9 years old, and the boy never got over that. That is his, you know, he's like over 50 now. That is his passion. When he wanted to go to a culinary institute, I said, you need college for cooking, but that is his passion, and he got his degree, and I supported him as best as possible after I couldn't talk him out of it.
I've forgotten his
So
name.
He's Shane.
Shane.
Yeah, yeah. He's doing okay. He's had some struggles, but he's doing okay, and he's doing what he wants to do, which is Chef Shane.
All right, thank you.
That's what it says on his white jacket, and that is like the text message I got. That's what he wants to do. Unlike me, who does a million things, who's a Jack Jill of all trades, you
Yes,
know,
you always were.
and always into a million things. That's the only thing, which is fascinating to me. That is I allowed him to follow his interests, whatever they were as a child, and that one is the one that stuck.
so Donna,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes, I don't know who's talking to me though. Okay, yes.
It's Maggie. I'm not very good at Zoom. I don't, but if everyone can hear me now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I can't stay very long, but boy, this is really fun to see all these known and familiar faces and other unknown people. Donna, I came to the Holt office probably 1984 with my
Okay.
son Solon, that many of
Okay.
you remember.
I certainly remember the name.
Right. Well, I also was one of the people who started the state homeschooling MHLA in Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
One of
You
the
might
things
remember this, Donna. The way I met Maggie was with your Greek calendar that we used to sell.
right.
I think we met first through that connection.
Right.
Oh,
Well, I lived in Greece for 13 years, and I actually came across John Holt first when I was living in Greece. And what was it, Freedom and Beyond, maybe? I used that as a textbook for one of my most advanced English learning students. She was, a high school student, and she loved that book. And that was such an interesting way to, get introduced to John Holt teaching in Greece. And Pat, I'm tickled that that the ad that you had for this meeting still is using the photograph that I took of all those kids sitting on
I
John's
love
lap.
that photo.
Oh, that was yours.
Yeah, Solon is in that. He's the one with red and yellow, gold. And I remember saying something like, John was just sitting there and I said something really stupid like, I wonder how many children can fit in John's lap.
Oh,
And there
they
was
all
this-
piled on.
there was this mad dash and John is sort of, okay. So
In fact,
so
I think you
Solon
may have
is
taken that
now-
photograph then, right?
What?
Did you take that photograph?
I did.
I thought so. Okay.
Yeah, it's still in use. I'm very glad. That's great.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And Solon and I now live a block apart. He's got 3 kids and he met his wife at Growing Without Schooling when Grace Llewellyn came to sign her first book, and they were both 15 years old. But are they homeschooling their kids?
Aw.
However, their oldest one, who is 15, has recently started at North Star, and I saw Susanna there, and then I ran into Aaron at the nearby library. And North Star is it just seems like it's an extension of homeschooling for many, many people, and he is absolutely thriving there.
Great.
Anyway.
Is Grace the one who wrote the Teenage Autodidact?
No, Teenage
No.
Liberation Handbook.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, she's out in Oregon.
So speaking of photographs, I don't know if you see this or not.
Oh,
But-
there's John.
Oh, man.
On a
Playing.
trip to Boston one time, we stopped in the office to buy a couple of the pianicas.
Yeah.
He was so
Your daughter
excited.
playing one.
And here's my daughter Julia, my 3rd daughter. John and I are blasting away, and it was a really favorite time for us, of course.
Oh, yeah.
Well, maybe this will work too. That's, if anybody can see that,
That's Solon, yeah.
that's Solon. He's a paramedic firefighter and also in charge of the simulation lab at the local community college, which
Wow.
means he makes mannequins die and nurses to be have to bring him back to life.
It's
Yeah.
also interesting that you said that you discovered John Holt through a Greek translation.
No, no,
Just no? Okay.
no, it was not.
I
a Greek
misunderstood
translation.
this.
I was teaching this young girl. I was teaching her English, and so
Okay.
we were reading it in English. I don't know. if it
Anyway,
exists in
but
Greek.
I'd like to add then not another, but one European experience.
Mhm.
I'm from Germany and also joining from Germany.
Mhm.
And I discovered John Holt's work in the middle of the 90s through a mention in Jean Liedloff's book about the baby carrier. And then I started to look for his books here in German translations. Many are translated, and I was able to get them in the pre-internet time. Some in German, some through international book learning. And for me, it was so, yeah, it shaped my way of learning. And about going about things, especially the book he wrote about his learning experiences with the cello in his 50s. And I was so fascinated by his work that I ended up writing a master's thesis about John Holt and his views on education, which nobody of you may have heard about because it was written in German, of course. And yeah, and I'm so glad to see you all. And I always follow the Facebook page, and I'm excited that there are still so many people interested in his work, which is not much known here still.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Got a hand raised?
Oh, yes, I see one. Yasvinder?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, hi.
Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you.
Okay, hi. I'm Jaswinder from India, New Delhi. Hello.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay, so I have a lot to share. I'm very overwhelmed at the moment. So I'll just try to share my experience. Uh, I think it was 1995. I first time someone gifted me these two books, How Children Fail and How Children Learn. I was in school and I was struggling with my academics. So I tried hard to actually understand for that time, but I think the literature for me was little tough being a school going person. But there are a lot of things which made sense that time. But I was not a very easy person. I was not able to fit in the school system in India. Okay, so finally I had to drop out from the school and I gave a private exam. Okay, independent. I had to basically register myself as an independent person and took that exam, school exam. So the point I'm here sharing is, so I made sure that I am not repeating this mistake with my child. So I am father now, and I have an 8-year-old son. His name is Dhruv. Okay, and we live in Delhi, and my wife is also working with the government with the Women and Child Development Department. So she comes from a social work background. So two of us are very much conscious, and we read together, both of us. And I try to communicate this idea of homeschooling with my wife. Okay, so initially she was, when my son was born, so I shared these books, John Holt's books, with her. So initially there were like little differences, but during COVID time, the day one of COVID lockdown, we started reading together this book, How Children Fail. Okay, and then we continued this first book and the second book, and after I think almost a month when we finished these two books, two of us were on the same page, and then she also understood that what all I've been saying, because I suffered. Okay, during those struggles during my school time and as I was growing up also. So, and from that day, okay, and I think it was 2020, March 2020. Okay, in India, the lockdown started, this COVID lockdown. So, so we've been raising our kid based on the principle or the book. So after finishing those two books, I was like wondering that what is the next step. So then we got this How Children Learning All the Time. Then I got this Teach Your Own. And then I study one book after another book. Then there's the Sharing Treasure. And when I was reading all those How Children Fail, there were a lot of books mentioned in each memoir or that those write-ups. So I started downloading those books also, like Genius at Work. Okay, and then there was one about phonics. Okay, so I got all those collections. In last, I think 3 years, I have almost all the books. We have been through, read through, referred. Okay, and the wonderful part I would like to share here is that in India in last 3 years, there's so much awareness about homeschooling. There are more than, I think, 14,000 people now, 14,000 kids and families doing homeschooling their kid. And most of them, when it comes to that, how do you do it? I think most of them refer to John Holt, because the way he has organized this literature, because I've been through all the people who given educational theories, but not how to homeschool. I think it's John Holt who has done a wonderful work. And these, I think, recently your team has done amazing work. Mr. Ferenga, I would say this Growing Without Schooling, editing the volume 1, volume 2, and volume 3, and volume 4. Okay, so here in New Delhi, I am kind of become the John Holt's ambassador. Okay, everyone who say Jastinder knows about everything about John Holt. Okay, and even this meeting, so I shared in the India group also on the Facebook. There's an India group. Okay, homeschooling India group. So I shared this is going to happen. Okay, so I was hoping there'll be more people here, but I'm surprised I am the only one here. Okay, so it's so nice. And then I came to know about this book by Suzanne, and I'm so happy to see that she's also here. She's written this 3 Are at Home. Okay, it's such an amazing work. Okay, and I'm so happy. to see all of you here and interacting with you all, because I had so many questions. Maybe I'll write down all those questions, because every day we are facing so many issues. Okay, because here in India, the homeschooling community is not in a transition. It's not that organized the way here. I think it's in US, but in India it's in transition. But a lot of data being because of technology. We have opportunities to actually connect with anyone, and I think this is the best example that the way we are. It was for me, it is a dream to connect and talk to you all. So thank you so much. Thank you. This is what I wanted to share.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Did you have any questions about John Holt himself as a person, or because that's really what I think the focus here tonight is?
Okay, not as such, because his books gave all the answers.
Yes.
All okay, and I think I've read there are a lot of Indian people also, like Rabindranath Tagore, Aurobindo, J. Krishnamurti. These people gave their theories, education theories, but no one like a very so in such a simple way. It's like after having your own kid, you study or you observe your kid, and no one has given that kind of reaction or documentation. It's like 100% what John Holt is writing in his first book, How Children Fail. Okay, it's like he's talking about my own son. In every page. Okay, he understood children so well that I think it's just a common sense. People miss that common sense, that, and I think he knew children, how children react or feel. I really can't imagine a person who didn't have his own kid could actually observe children so well and in such a wonderful manner.
I think Susanna has something to say.
Actually, I do.
Oh, Aaron.
When I reflect upon John Holt and his life and career, what impresses me so much is how far ahead of his time he was, and still is ahead of his time. I mean, decades, many decades ahead of his time. And, you know, one time Ivan Illich mentioned to David Cayley about Holt that he was a monomaniacal man. And yes, he certainly had a focus on homeschooling, but I think Ivan was wrong about that. Because when I think of John, I think of him as a polymath, as someone who had so many varied interests, not just homeschooling or not even just children, as the letter you read early on indicates. He was interested in social change. He was interested in social justice. He was interested in how communities form. He was interested in ecology long before most other people were. He was interested in music and art and so many things. And it seems to me that we have so much still to learn from him, that it's not just homeschooling. It's really, what type of a society do we want? And how can we get towards that society without shaping people? Because that, I think, was one of the things that he was so adamantly against, that when we try to shape people, even with good intentions, we end up doing damage. We end up hurting them. We end up creating people who then want to rebel against that shaping for good reason. And so that's, I just wanted to say that John had so many varied interests. He was such an intelligent person. He saw things so clearly and had so many ideas of ways to go, ways to explore. So that's how I am really indebted to him. I so wish he had lived just a few years longer. I had so many questions I would have loved to ask him. And,
absolutely.
You know, he died at age 62, which is so young. When you think how many more years he might have lived, and we were robbed of his wisdom and his insights. But I want to be grateful for the ones that he did leave behind.
Right.
He was over the moon about tilapia, the fish, I mean, I just, you know,
yes.
a whole letter about that, because it was how you could have sustainable food. And I'm just going to take the space to say, when I first looked in the file, the big cabinet of manila folders with the letters, correspondence from which I drew for Life We're Living, and the file folders are labeled with all these things you would imagine John's file folders might be labeled with on the one hand, because it's names of all the wonderful correspondence and everything. So you've got, Herndon, Goodman, Dennison, et cetera, but then you had a file called Mocha Cake. So, everything's important. That's important. A lot of interest and pleasure is important. I'm making that point to add to Aaron.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. You were showing photos before, Peter. I got two visual aids to share, but this is to the point that, John really, his thinking and his interest always went beyond just like, education. And he saw education in a much more holistic view. Suzanne and Aaron and Wendy, you guys might recognize this letter. It hung in the office, where Peg Durkee and I, then me was. And it's a letter to John from then Senator George McGovern. Now, when McGovern ran for president, he was floating the idea of John Holt as Secretary of Education. And he writes that because McGovern wrote an introduction to the one of the revisions of how, I think the first revision of the first printing of the revision of how.
He had How Children Fail in his briefcase, he said.
Yeah. And so in this letter, he's thanking John. He says, "Dear John, your letter of December 12th is beautiful. It sets forth exactly the reasons why the new right-wing coalition in the Democratic Party is so wrong and why we need to pursue the initiatives that I sought in 1972. I deeply appreciate your continuing commitment to fundamental change in our public agenda. Isn't it incredible that we are now using B-52s over North Vietnam? With all good wishes, I am sincerely yours." And then he handwrites at the bottom. And this is it comes back to this thing about him being ahead of his time. I remember what's his name? Andrew Young, when he was running for president, he wanted to give people a minimum income, and that I think it was $1,000, and people laughed it down. So McGovern writes, "I did nothing about the Village Voice piece that you sent me on November 28th, John, but in due course, history will show that our $1,000 per person taxable grant in lieu of welfare was not so radical, and the press and the public are behind. I know you are aware of that." So I mean, these ideas seem so new, and they get shut down like, "Oh, that's so modern." It's like, and then we saw, like in COVID, how giving people direct cash grants helped them so much more than all this other stuff. So yeah, he was pretty far ahead on a lot of things, and that always impressed me. And then the other thing I wanted to share was about music. But one of the things that always got me about John was he would play his cello in the public garden. And he was friends with an illustrator. His name is David McPhail, and McPhail wrote several books with this character called Henry Bear. In fact, he actually had a couple of bookstores in Boston called Henry Bear's Park. And this was another thing that was hanging in the Holt office that I've always
Did you wind up with that? Okay, I wonder who got the Henry Bear picture.
So this is a portrait of Henry Bear that looks like John Holt playing the cello in the public garden.
Yeah.
And McPhail wrote at the bottom, "For John, whose fine cello playing has inspired Henry no end, from David, August 1976. So John is influenced people in many ways, but and not just this idea that children are good at learning, and all of this ties into that theme, doesn't it? And children are good at learning, and so let's involve them in art and music and politics and all this other stuff.
I have a question regarding that. I always used to wonder about the work he did before he became a teacher. I understood that he worked at some world office, but I never really found out what it was, and just made a connection. It may have been anything like what they have in The Hague and the Netherlands. About the peace movement, but I'm not sure if that is correct. And do you know more about this? And did he continue with these ideas regarding the letter, the first one you wrote us?
I'll let Susanna answer that. But yeah, it was called The World Federalists.
I mean, what little bit there is about that on record is in the A Life Worth Living, the collection of his letters, just because that collection does begin sort of just with him, I guess, just after he was on the submarine in World War II. So then is a little bit of the World Federalist time, and you see him caring about that idea of world government, but then distressed with the organization itself, et cetera, and moving on, to other things as young people do. But so I think what there is to read about that is probably available there.
Thank you.
What's going through my mind is a comment John made one time when I was acknowledging his value and his significance. And he said, be careful not to treat me as a living statue. And I think what he was saying relates to kind of a question I have, which is, well, if he's so great and so smart and had all these great ideas, why didn't they stick? It's like the old, if you're so smart, why ain't you rich kind of thing. And I think one of the answers is because there wasn't a concerted effort to bring together people from different disciplines, if you will, and different ways of life, who were all saying the same or similar things in terms of the world that we wanted to see and the way we wanted to see it, to gain momentum from the synergy of the group. It was kind of John Holt against the world. I mean, I know there were the George Dennisons and James Herndons and but they were all less successful, I think. Maybe.
Well, Peter, I hate to contradict you, but I know that you are very established in this community, and I have not been as much a writer as many of the folks on here. But when I worked at the office, one of John's thrills was getting another state having a homeschooling group. And I almost found myself asking Jasvinder, do you have a group? Do the kids go on nature walks or study math together? I just want to say that I think that in so many ways, it hasn't become a worldwide phenomena, but John was just thrilled with the organization of the entire United States with homeschooling groups. And in that way, he was fulfilling this work that you're describing as possibly missing. Just my opinion.
No, I agree with you. And, Susanna and I were involved in that work in Pennsylvania. And the only way we were able to succeed was to create a united effort between the, for want of a better term, secular humanists and the evangelical Christians. Neither group would have succeeded without the other, even though we so strongly disagreed in so many other areas. It's that kind of collaborative effort that did result in the changing of the state laws. But what I'm saying is, I think we need the same kind of large-scale collaborative effort now to make even bigger changes, because still the compulsory schooling is still the name of the game. It's still what federal funding is all about. There's this tremendous backlash against any support of the privatization of education because of the religious connections. And we're going to end up with just very little progress on a large scale. And that's what I'm saying, I think is missing. Hence the article in today's New York Times. It's back to basics once again. So we got to shift the paradigm.
Well, John was trying to shift the paradigm by pulling the emphasis off schools. And, you know, I mean,
Right, but he's just
you
one
know the whole
boy.
story, Peter. I mean, I've been part of so many efforts of trying to create national homeschool organizations. And the ones that have the power are the ones that had the financing and you know, a religious and political background that everyone agreed on, and they kicked everybody else out. I mean, Raymond Moore was, you know, one of the rare ecumenical leaders in the movement. I mean, I remember him saying from the podium that even atheists should be able to homeschool. I can't imagine anybody saying that at a Christian homeschooling conference.
So Pat, here's my model. My model is the delegates to the Second Continental Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And if slave owners and abolitionists can get together to start a new country, then Christians and secular humanists, again, I don't really like that term, but you know what I'm saying, New Age, whatever, ought to be able to get together to declare the same kind of independence from the school paradigm and figure out how to get the job done. You can't be more different, in my never to be humble opinion again, than slave owners and abolitionists. And yet they agreed, let's not talk about that. Let's keep our eyes on the prize of starting our own country. And
Aaron and Susanna, I think you wanted to respond, or I'm sorry, you're not done, Peter. Go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, if any one of the colonies had declared war or independence against Britain, they would have been squashed like a bug. They knew that their only chance of survival, of success, was if they united. As different as Georgia was from Massachusetts, as different as Georgia is from Massachusetts today.
Okay, so this is fun. It's like having I don't know what, a family discussion with a lot of listeners, and
Yeah.
yeah, engaging or something. But I just want to speak to one little piece of the whole fascinating thing, because this is like a seminar, but I put in the chat, Peter, you happen to use the word, and you may tell me it's not the word, you said, the ideas haven't stuck. And in all of this interesting discussion, I've just been musing on what that even means, because I'm saying an and, you taught me that, not a but a and statement. I'm holding a lot of all true at once kind of thoughts here when I say that, because we see the thing about how, things have not fundamentally shifted and a lot of things are worse now and all that stuff. My and thought is, what is it for ideas to have stuck when we're sitting here talking about the ideas of a man who's been gone a long time? Lots of organizations don't even survive the death of a founder, much less thrive, as Holt Associates did for so. It's interesting. I mean, that's a different topic, but stuck. What, the ideas are still being discussed, lived, practiced in a whole lot of ways. So I'm just musing. I wonder, Peter, there's a larger topic, but if by stuck you mean become the majority, become the dominant paradigm.
Yes, I don't mean just stuck around.
Yeah, well, my feeling is that you can't get from one person to a majority like that. It doesn't happen like that. If there were 50, 100, 500, 1,000, if there were, I don't know how many children were raised differently because of what went into that magazine, what John put into his books, then every one of those children is a different person than they would have been if John hadn't done what he had done, and if Susanna and I hadn't done what we'd done, and whoever else may be here, you're included.
So Donna, here's something right to that point that puzzles me. I know so many young people who are homeschooled, who are sending their young people to school, to a regular school.
Circumstances are different. We sent our daughter to school. But that was circumstances. By then we were living in the Netherlands, and we were told in so many words, we do not allow homeschooling here under
Yes,
any circumstances.
yes,
So,
that's a
okay,
special
he went to
cause.
school.
That's a special cause. I'm talking about folks in the United States
Yeah.
who grew up where the Sudbury Valleys and the open connections and the whatever talk about what independent free thinkers and self-directed learners, et cetera, they are cranking out. Why is it that those people, when they become parents, are not expanding the number of homeschoolers?
Well, is that the only way to show
Well-
a good result? Is
No,
having homeschooled children yourself is the single measure?
no,
I don't
I
think
didn't say
so.
that. So no, I wouldn't say that.
No, I don't think so. I think it's
Peter
more
wants
like
to
how
add something.
open-minded they may be, how creative they may be. Things, I would look for things like that.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
I'm looking for the button to raise my hand and I can't find it. So
Yeah,
I'm
you
sorry
raise-
that I'm just
you
learning
actually
out.
raise
You
your
can just
hand.
wave too like that. I'll see it.
I don't know. Anyway, so I wanted to answer directly, like jump into this particular thing, and I've been scratching down thoughts here. But I just wanted to, I'll try to keep this brief, just throw an introduction. Peter, now my hair is very wet, Peter, so you probably don't recognize me as much, but I'm Diane Weber's sister. And I met you 10 years ago, came here for the conference and at Harvard. And I walked up to you and so for everyone else, my sister Diane, I'm from Philadelphia area, and Diane is a very key person at Open Connections, which of course Peter founded. And so anyway, but I look and sound just like her. So when I walked up to Peter 10 years ago, he looked at me like I know that's not Diane, but
Right.
but anyway, so I've been a home ed parent since 2006. I'm 7 years younger than Diane, so she was ahead of me, and she was my direct inspiration for home educating because I didn't have kids at that point. But I'm looking at what she's doing. I'm like, oh my God, they like own their lives. What's that about? Like a family, like because when you send your kids to school, you don't own much of your life, the school owns. Anyway, and I had never heard of homeschooling before that. She introduced me to John Holt when she came up here to visit me. This is before I had kids. And this is, I guess, at the tail end of the office being on Mass Ave. And we stopped in there. I had no idea about any of this. So she probably went in and met you, Pat. I don't know. Anyway, so that was my introduction to it all. And from there, my kids are 18 and about to turn 23. And so they're grown now, but we were always home educating. And not only that, John Holt was just this huge inspiration. Again, like I think the first name I heard of. And I'll answer the question and I'll continue about John Holt in a little bit, but he greatly inspired the work. And now I've been a home ed advocate for a long time, and I'm starting an organization, but I've listened to what you're saying, Peter, and as soon as you started talking about it, I felt like I knew what you were talking about, because it was not about stuck around, it's stuck with. And I can speak from my perspective in my life as a home ed advocate on a million forums, and I admin a few of them. So I'm right in the thick of at least people communicating in that way, like on Facebook forums and whatever. And I consult with parents all the time in groups and stuff. And I've seen shifts that when I started back in 2006, and if you were to start conversing about John Holt and those ideas and so forth, you get a lot of conversation going and people kind of knew what you were talking about, whatever. Now I put it out there, and it doesn't get, I think part of it has to do with the last 3 years and the reasons a lot of people jumped on homeschooling.
Yeah.
But I think also part of it is, it might be John Holt that spoke to this. I don't know. But a long time ago, I remember hearing a quote, or remember hearing something, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought it was John Holt who warned about the proliferation of homeschool centers. And I'm not talking about just any centers, like I'm familiar with Open Connections and various things. I'm talking about just creating centers where you're essentially just creating another school. Like, because you actually feel that a child needs, like, how else are you going to function outside of a school unless they're in a place and mimicking the hours and being in a building like they would be in school. And I think that has shown up a lot, especially in the last 3 years, because there's a lot of parents jumping on this, and they really haven't put this, they really haven't explored, and they haven't deschooled and all this stuff. So they're like, well, my kid needs to be somewhere, and this, and so there's the proliferation of all these ideas and places, and that are just not, let's just say, not what John Holt was talking about. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was him that warned against, yes, this is a world we want to create, but let's not recreate another system, that's like mirrors schools. Like, we don't want to create another set of places, because then we might have left the school thing, but then we're creating this whole other thing where children are just in a place, you know what I mean? And as opposed to out in the world. And I'm seeing a lot of that. And so that, like, so when you started talking, Peter, that's what came to my mind, is that, yes, it's stuck around, and we're having this conversation now, and there's a lot of unschoolers and other people who get it and whatever. But I personally wish I was seeing it play out more, because I don't feel like I'm seeing it played out as, the philosophies that and ideas that John Holt put out there. So I know I've talked a lot. I'll just be quiet
No,
for a
it's fine.
second.
I suspect that what you're remembering referred to him talking about the free school, alternative school type movement, where it'd be a place you could put your kid so you would have free time to do your job or whatever. And it would be the place, and you could sort of hope it would have the right theories and philosophies, but it wouldn't be the same as what he would recommend. And on the
Yeah, it was a long time ago, and so I can't remember the exact words, but he just warned about, just don't just stick them in another place for the sake of stick them in another place. Yeah.
I think Gina's been
and the other point that I think you're making, I too have noticed, I mean, I'm out of the country, so I just kind of pick up the United States from the computer and so on. But I get the feeling the name John Holt and his work is vanishing, that people don't recognize them as a character, or as a philosophy, as a name very much. But that may be because I'm at such a distance.
No.
But I think he could be fading, and it could be a chance we have to realize this and to do something to kind of re-inject the system, if possible, so that he make sure he doesn't fade away altogether. At least, are his books all in print? Are they able to be found, and so on? And this is kind of thing Pat, I think, has been working on for 20 years.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's been a phenomenal service, because so many of the other authors really have disappeared. So I mean, I think all kinds of kudos to Pat for keeping John available and out there. But so here's an example of, or here's another partial reason for why it hasn't perhaps grown, or some of it stuck, is there is a tendency to become a purist and to think, well, if you're not doing it exactly the way I'm thinking, then you're not really doing it. And that'll kill a new idea. And it's the variation, it's the diversity of interpretation that will cause an idea to grow and to develop, rather than remain a fundamentalist, if you will, and say, if you don't practice exactly the way it was written, then you're not really doing it. It was often said that there are certain aspects of the situation of families that John didn't understand because he was never a parent. And that was used to dismiss the value of what he was saying, which I think was totally inappropriate. But the appropriate part is he didn't understand the full picture of individual families who were not in a position and could not be in a position, not due to a lack of resources necessarily, although that was one of them. But our whole economy is based on the custodial role of schools. And so if parents could find a way to a much less oppressive and much freer way, not a perfect way, to have their children grow and learn without being at home, I think that should have been celebrated. And in the same way that Danny Greenberg, poo-pooed homeschooling. If you didn't go to a democratic school, then you weren't going to learn how to be in a democratic society, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of standardization of the left, to me, is no better than the standardization of the right.
Gina, you had your hand up before. I forgot. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So, I mean, I see John's work in everything that we do. Like, I'm just going to go through numbers, right? So, prior to COVID, 1.7 million homeschoolers, right? And it just keeps growing. We think approximately probably 20 or more % of those homeschoolers are true unschoolers in John Holt fashion, right? I see John in self-directed learning centers. I see him in all of these amazing things that are happening. Like, the growth of the movement is happening. We see this. Like during COVID, there was a article in the New York Times about the rise of unschooling, the rise of interest. Those pandemic pods, they were all unschooling based. And although possibly people aren't giving credit to Holt, right, because they don't know him or they haven't heard of their work, or they're not giving credit to anybody really, his hands are in all of this. And I think it's super important that we acknowledge it. Without him, there wouldn't be that growth in homeschooling. Without him, there wouldn't be self-directed learning centers, right? There wouldn't be any of this without him. And so I think, like, yes, there's that other side where, like, oh, we don't hear Holt's name as often, but there's also this very, very vivid and live culture that is just growing and growing and growing. We see it in research. We see it in schools of education. So I don't want to dismiss Holt's hand in everything, because I think his hand is in everything.
That's good to hear.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Peter is helping to organize an event. It doesn't have a date yet where he wants to do a.
Yeah, I put it in the chat, Pat.
Oh yeah. Oh okay.
April
I just sent you an email, Peter.
All right. And yeah, but I also wonder, to John's bigger point that we've all mentioned, he mentions explicitly in that letter I read, maybe this isn't an education issue. Maybe we're like running around in circles because we haven't really identified the issue, which is this whole idea of what do we do with children in our society? Where else can they be? What else? Are there other ways of thinking of this? Illich often proposed. I remember him using the words, complimentary, whenever I would complain to him about, the pressure we're getting from educators and stuff, Yvonne would respond, "You're not a threat to them. Tell me you're a compliment to them." You're, to carve out a space And I'm wondering, maybe that's what we need, and stop talking about, children are great at learning and just say, let's create a space where people can have a public sphere or a private area that is theirs and that they can organize and work within, that is not touchable by reading specialists, math specialists, and socialization specialists, and financial analysts, and all that other stuff. I mean, not that we need to be separate from it. I mean, my own experience, everyone I know homeschools in schools, at some point, their children are taking a course somewhere, maybe with 4-H or whatever, but it doesn't mean that we don't use these resources. But I don't know, every time we get into this education summit idea and trying to, to change it from that point of view, it just makes me feel a little empty. Like, here we go again.
Yeah,
Maybe we need to attack it
conferences. John wrote bitterly somewhere about how many conferences he was invited to and how he enjoyed them. He loved talking with the people who picked him up at the airport and fed him at their house and so on. But the whole scheme of having conferences, it didn't really seem to pay off.
Right. Well, for us, for the Christian groups, I mean, but again, they had to sign statements of faith and create these, these tight-knit groups. But there's plenty of Christians that don't sign those statements of faith and who don't like those sorts of tactics, But again, isn't that past? I don't know. I don't know how that relates.
No,
to
I think trashing conferences is like trashing writing. And
Yeah.
so, well, John's just more books. I mean, look at all the books out there already about how people learn and all that sort of thing that started long before John showed up. And
Yeah.
that's no way to diminish the value of John and books. And there are certainly a lot of people who have said, well, I went to the Reimagined Education or Reinvent or whatever. I didn't go, or the Arrow conferences. And they say it made all the difference for me. I learned from all these different people. So it depends on what the goal is.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but again, to sort of beat my point into the ground, I think what's important is that we need to identify ultimately what is the goal that in large numbers we can unite behind, and then park our egos at the door and not say, well, as long as everybody's going to go to a democratic school, I'll support it. Or as long as you're an unschooler, I'll support it. The picture's got to be bigger than that. It has to do with changing the culture and changing the way we view other people and economics. It's all of a package. But people have their own personal areas of highest interest. But I think all those people have to come together, not all of them, but we've got to come together in large enough numbers to say, I see the benefit in uniting with you in working towards our shared goal. And for some, there's a specific interest in dealing with racism, and others, the issues of transgenders. People who are fighting to deal with the transgender issue in public schools. They never even heard of John Holt, let alone self-directed education. And they may think that regular school is the bee's knees. Their only issue is, with what's affecting them. And some of the strongest proponents back in the 60s and now of back to basics have been African Americans, because they were taught by Bill Cosby, among others, that success in school was the way up and out of, quote, the ghetto, unquote, and they're still invested in the school paradigm. And I found in starting the Natural Creativity Center in the inner city in Philadelphia, that we had to work really hard with families of color to convince them that there was another, and in our view, better way for young people to grow and learn than conventional schooling.
Peter, this thought that you have has caused me to want to ask a question of Patrick and Donna and Susanna, if she's still nearby, but one of you. It's making me think about John's time in the alternative school movement and how it turned him towards the idea that parents just needed to do it themselves. I know that the three of you know a lot more about that than I do. I just remembered as a kernel of an important thing. But since this is a celebration of his life and what you're saying makes me think of that, Peter, I wanted to ask the three of them if one of them would address that, what his thoughts were about that.
I'll quickly jump in because I actually was going to say this earlier and I cut it from my opening remark, but John wrote, as I said, in Instead of Education, schools are bad because they start with an essentially bad idea, not just mistaken and impossible, but bad in the sense of morally wrong, that some people have or ought to have the right to determine what a lot of other people know and think. As long as they start from this bad idea, they cannot become better. And I don't want to take part any longer in any public pretense that they can. I am not going to waste any more time or energy, and have wasted a great deal, trying to change them or make them better. All I want is for them being the schools, to let those people who want to teach their own children and to bother these people as little as possible.
Right. And he also used the metaphor that school's a burning building, and he wanted to help whoever wanted to get out, get out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what I'm trying to do is be part of an effort to put the fire out.
I think Aaron might have something to contribute on this because you spent time with John in Denmark with the schools.
Not with John, but I just wanted to say that when John first started to talk about homeschooling to families, those families were thinking about starting some type of an alternative school or free school, and they had to go through all the rigmarole of doing that. And he ended up just asking them, do you really want to go through all this trouble of starting this other type of institution, or do you just want a good situation for your own kids? Most of them said the latter. And so he then said, well, why don't you just do it yourself? It's going to be much easier and probably a lot more fun. You don't have to deal with all the bureaucracy and hoops that you have to jump through to start a school. And then it went off from there. And then Growing Without Schooling was formed.
And it's not as though homeschooling is itself some monolithic panacea, whatever. I mean, all this talk, some of it going on richly in the chat about, evolving thought and what we don't know what John would be saying now, and, all those things and sort of context at the time. Like, I'm also thinking about Pat's comment about, what are the deeper issues? Like this big, the question that's underlying a lot of your queries, Peter, is sort of what's the obstacle? Why has it not caught on to a greater extent? And what's the it? Part of it is the sense that people can be trusted to make decisions about their own lives, the belief in, freedom and dignity and all of these big things. And Wendy, to your question, I mean, these things are like, we could give whole seminars on them and stuff, but like one of the places that John came to regarding schools and even the alternative schools was that people didn't really believe in freedom in the way that he had hoped. And even freedom is a word, because what does that mean? There's definitions of freedom nowadays that probably none of us would sign on to, but the basic idea of are you, his critiques of free schools was that some free schools were using freedom kind of as a trick, as a motivator, not really, but so this sort of quest for how are there some fundamental things that people disagree on really profoundly? And some of the sadness at the end of John's life, I think, was about that maybe there are some that people are not, there isn't enough support for some of these greater, like the beliefs that underlie all of this. But those are questions. These are bigger questions. I don't think we can wrap them up in this brief, a celebration of 100 years since John's birth.
And another way of summarizing that, in the beginning, the introduction to How Children Learn, he basically said, all I am saying in this book can be boiled down to 2 words: trust children. But then he went on to say that that's a difficult thing for most people to do because we were not trusted as children. And that's one of the things we have to grapple with, I think, as a society, as well as individuals.
I would like to know if people here have experience with forest schools. My daughter lived in California for about 10 years, and she worked and visited some. And there are places that have like kindergarten age. These kids are climbing to the tops of tall trees. They're wading in the mud into the rivers. They have certain safety guidelines, but other than that, they are trusted to be children out in the woods. It's amazing. And apparently it came from Scandinavia. I don't know if it was Denmark where they first had forest schools. Does anybody recognize this?
Yeah.
Do you have them in Massachusetts?
No. I've come across it in literature that I've read about all school. Although there is a place in the Carolinas. There are like schools like that. At least 1 or 2.
There's a lot in California. They're scattered every county or so down the coast. So
yeah, I know that Sharon Chung had her hand up, and Edward had his hand up too. So we'll go with Sharon first.
Okay. I have a little voice, so I use my hand like a schoolgirl. It happened, my daughter and granddaughter stopped by. So in answer to a question a little bit before, Tanya actually shared with me a few days ago that she had a client who mentioned John Holt. So I'll let Tanya tell you a little story.
he doesn't
Well,
remember.
Mom homeschooled my brother, sister, and I don't know, did you already share everything?
No.
About that?
No.
Okay, she homeschooled us for maybe a couple years, and then I started college at 15. My sister 13, my brother, I guess 17 or 18. So anyways, I had experience with it. And then my daughter Bella's 13 now, and she's been homeschooling the whole time, and she loves it. And I told her at any point if she wanted to try out any other kind of school, she could, but she's not interested. She loves it. She's a creative genius type. And then to not be restricted by school is incredible. So nothing has dampened her creativity. And she writes on this whole other level that I don't know anybody else that writes like she does. So she's been writing a couple different books and hoping to get published sometime soon. You want to see? She's also teaching her grandmother ballroom dance. She's an amazing ballroom dancer and eventually going to be an instructor. And so she's been teaching my mom.
That's great.
It's very fun. So I have the 3 children that Tanya mentioned, and the family lives up in Maine. There are schools down along the coast that are letting kids just play. That's what I call it. It's been a little tricky during COVID for some of these places to thrive, but
Yeah.
potentially, I think they're going to start back up. Yeah, so I believe John Holt's legacy is going to be around 200 years from now, and it's going to be more and more. And yeah, it's just fabulous. And
Good to
it's
hear.
I forgot, but I remember that she said she wants to homeschool her kids. They're not old enough yet, but and throughout the last 40 years or so, I always hear John Holt's name pop up. And I think we're little people out here always pushing his concepts. And it's almost like you have to have the incentive to push it a little bit because people just don't know what they don't know.
Right, right.
So that's, I could write a book on this, but I'll go with that. Thank you. Thank you for
Sure. Cindy has something to say, but I want to mention this before because it's a little off topic. But so Holt Associates officially closed in 2001, and then I founded Holt GWS LLC, which I run out of my house. This is it. You're looking at it. But to this day, including yesterday, I don't know if you could see this, Susanna. I'm getting mail for you. It says Susanna Sheffer, Holt Associates, 13. You have my address. This arrived on Friday. Business mailing, the mailing list business never gives up. All right. I'm sorry.
You had said
So Cindy,
you had said Edward was next.
Yes, Cindy. Cynthia.
Oh, Edward's not next. Oh, okay. And thank you for whoever told me how to raise my hand so I could go and click on it. Yeah, I wanted to speak to a couple different things, but Peter, I'm definitely going to contact you because I'm like right in there and in making some change. I think, when the conference thing was brought up, and again, conferences can look many ways, whatever. But I think as a concept of people getting together, whether it's like this or at a big physical conference, whatever, it just goes back to the fundamental human connection. I mean, if you look at the suffragette movement, right, and you look at all the letters that have gone between those leaders, and I see this as, it's a similar type of thing, and I'm not necessarily trying to put it on that scale or whatever, but the point is, this is just a basic communication. Back then they did it by letters, whatever, and they shared ideas, and it took a long time, right, in various forms and struggle, whatever. And I don't, whether we're talking about this or that or whatever your idea is, I think it's the same concept. So whether you get together in a physical conference or whatever it is, the sharing of ideas to keep something alive and to make gradual change. And it is frustrating. And I think I imagine the frustration has been shared, has been a sentiment of anyone who's gotten together with strong ideas trying to make changes in the world. I don't think there's an exception to that. Every single person has felt a frustration because a person only lives for so long, and you want to make a difference, and you want to see the changes. And that's not necessarily how it happens. It takes a long time, and we don't necessarily get to see the fruits of, those things during our time. So there's a lot of inherent frustration with that. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there as a reality check, but just a note of encouragement to just, we just keep plugging away. I mean, I would love to see, I'm a big Gatto fan too, and I'd love to see the whole thing overhauled. That's not going to happen in my lifetime, but I, just the ideas taking seed, and just to know I put that in my kids, put those ideas in my kid, in my older daughter, is going to run with that a little bit in her life. And someone made the comment earlier that you have a bunch of kids who have been homeschooled and unschooled or whatever, and that's part of them, and they're going forward, and you know what I mean? Like it's proliferating, but it's just a long process. So anyway.
John always felt social change was incremental, not lasting change. Tanya Ordain has written about meeting John in the chat. It's pretty interesting. She met John in Mexico at Cuernavaca at a Illich conference, and she talks about mentioning to him about homeschooling in 1972. And I just want to point out that that's not the first. John was always interested in that, and as Sonia's remembrance shows. But someone asked me once, when did John start thinking about it? And so I don't know. I made a point of going through his books over a period of time, and it was the underachieving school there, which was, I believe, 1968. In one of his responses, one of his essays there, he suggests that if the school is that bad, the parents have the right to take the child out and teach them at home. So even in 1968, this was a germ in his head.
Well, I think what was being described, though, is the difference between evolution and revolution. And imagine in 1962, you're an African American in the United States and you can't vote. And somebody were to say to you, you got to be patient and keep working at it. And it's going to take a long time, but eventually you'll get the right to vote. And the response was, no, I'm not going to wait. And we had the civil rights movement, and we had nonviolent and mostly direct action that resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 64 or 65. But that's what brought enough politicians around to change the law. It certainly didn't end discrimination, and there's still all manner of problems, but it was a great leap forward in terms of creating opportunities. And yes, there are many, many states that are trying to undermine it, with their various regulations, but the federal law is still in place. And the same thing is true with the suffragette movement, and women's wanting to vote, and with gay rights. It wasn't until the organization ACT UP started their demonstrations that finally people said, we've got to pay attention to this situation and start making changes. And that's what I'm saying I think is needed now. Not quietly withdraw your own family from school and homeschool, not even just and not send them to a democratic school. I mean, that's great for those individuals, and I'm all in favor of that. And obviously, because of the work that I've done, I support that. But that isn't going to shift the paradigm. And the paradigm, and this, I'm sorry, I beat this drum 100 times here. This is the last time. I don't think the paradigm is going to shift until all of the people who generally support the concepts that John and others have represented work together in an active fashion. And the key word in there is together.
Okay.
Well, I have to respond to that.
Okay.
The years I was at Holt Associates, I came in 79 and John died in 84. Those years, we saw tremendous numbers of political, social change. I think, Peter, you must have gone through this in your state. And we heard from every state across. And Wendy was saying how happy we were to hear of a new state where we could refer people and let them be organized. There was a tremendous amount of organization and fighting and going to the state house, wearing name badges and talking to legislators and getting laws changed and learning how to look up the law, not realizing that a little setback wasn't a permanent setback. All these things were going on. So that stage we've been through of just allowing people to have the right to keep their child out of school.
Right. And that was one.
So that's one point. So that's part of the paradigm that we've been through that. And the second is to say that people agreed with John Holt's ideas, that man had a lot of ideas. He had so many ideas, many but you've never heard. No, nobody's heard all of John's ideas. He had so many ideas, nobody could agree with them all. And you'd be likely lucky to find 50 people in the country who would sign on to everything John ever said. Now, I agreed with a lot of what he said. That's why I was there. But that's a very broad battle to choose.
We're nearing the end. I said we'll go to the 2:30, but I want to make sure that anyone who hasn't spoken yet, if there's anyone that would like to say something, this would be a good time. And then I know Cindy's got her hand up, so I'll let you get the last word in after somebody else. Anybody else have anything to say?
Hi, how are you? I've been quietly in the background.
Rachel. Yeah.
How are you? I homeschooled my kids for a bunch of years, around 25 years ago. And I had studied about John Holt when I was in college, and I was taking a sociology of education class, and I found him on my own, not through the class. So I feel about the concept of a movement. When I read John Holt, I felt like he was saying, forget the movement, homeschool your kids. And that's what I did. I didn't forget the movement, because for 30 years now, I've been trying to figure out how to change the world and how to, in my own way. And I still believe in that, but I don't think people agree exactly from different walks of life, what exactly they would want to see either in alternative style schools or homeschools. I think there's a lot of variation, which is what I think Peter was referring to when he said you have to have the abolitionists and the both, all the sides come together. So I don't know how easy it would be to focus on a movement. I don't think that's what I thought John Holt was doing for me. He was telling me, he was empowering me to teach my kids in whatever way I felt. And I bring the values to my kids. I don't want the school to bring the values to my kids, and mine might be different than yours. So I feel like that's how I celebrate him. Although I agree, I'd love some movement, but I might not agree exactly on which movement to change, to change everything. He totally changed my life. As a kid, I thought up the concept in my own head. Like, I should be homeschooled. I was so miserable in school. That's why I ended up homeschooling my kids as long as I could. And so when I found his writings, it was so resonant. It was so exciting for me to see somebody saying the things that I was feeling as a child, and then to be able to use what he said and expand upon that with other books he guided us to and everything, and to be able to bring that to my kids. And that to me was what he was about. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was well said. Cindy, and then Ed.
Okay, make sure. Okay, I have my volume on. I really like the concept that you brought up, Peter, about evolution versus revolution. And I think, and so much of what you brought up just needs to, well, it must, because that's what you're trying to do. But in terms of the content of this conversation, it does need to spill over into another conversation. So I'm all for that. But I think John Holt's work I touched on it before when I introduced myself. It inspired me so much, but not just in the organization that I started, which is actually about more than home education, but it stemmed from that. But he inspired me to question everything. And when I started becoming interested in home education, then it kind of woke me up to government control issues, which span many things, not just educate, whatever, and corporate control and you name it. So, which is wonderful. And, but it also plays into, while the work I do is probably more on the evolution side, and I think just people home educating every day and just being an example is more of the evolution side as opposed to the revolution side. I'm all for the revolution side. I want to be educated, and I think just reading through John's stuff again will help me, maybe inspire me, educated on how we go forward from here. Because it's such a complicated, it's such a complex web of things. It's not just simply a matter of changing a law, or, you know, it's but anyway, I'm you know, would like to have that conversation for anyone else who wants to you know, jump in that. So thank you for putting this whole thing together.
Thanks for participating, Cindy. Ed, would you like to say something?
I wasn't necessarily originally going to say something, but I thought, like just what Cynthia said about, the first thing was just to thank everyone for organising this today. It's actually 4:30 in the morning where I'm from Sydney, Australia, and I was lucky I woke up. Lucky I woke up just after 3. I'm in my pajamas. I don't know if you can see that. And I woke up whilst it was, because I saw it was going to be 3 a.m. my time. I thought, will I be able to? But I woke up about 20 past 3 and I'd left the computer on and actually was going to the toilet. I heard people talking. I thought, okay, what have I done? But anyway, that's just how I'm here. And yeah, I mean, the first thing I said, just want to thank everybody who organised this on the 100th birthday of John. I came to his ideas in the late 90s. It was actually was in relation to schooling or education. I've never had any children or anything. It was actually a local Anchor's bookstore that had some of his books, and I'd never been interested particularly. I never enjoyed the school experience particularly, and then I read one book, and then that led on to, and it seems to be a little bit similar to what Rachel said and other people. I think I've got, I can't remember her name. You would all know it. Grace Llewellyn. I think she described it in a similar way, who I think does those not to school camps. I don't know if she still does them and all these things. But I think just in general, I think Peter was talking earlier about, okay, it can be just about people taking their children out of school because of the experience their children's undergoing, but it has many implications for the rest of our lives. And I'm sure a lot of people here have already or know about that and have even spoken about that. And okay, it may create barriers or obstacles, but I think whatever can be done, which even if they're little things that can improve people's lives, including children's lives. And I think the rich pool of ideas that have been generated in the homeschooling movement, which John was a big part of, I think that only strengthens and can be celebrated, because I think it personally has had a huge impact on how I view this education, formal education, on top of just how to live your life or how you might want to live your life and what sort of changes you might want to make. So I'm happy just to leave it at there, but I just thought I'd say something at the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It's heartening seeing so many familiar faces who I haven't seen in years. It's great. I hope it's not going to, maybe we'll just get together annually for celebrate John's birthday, you know. But yeah, it's been a great pleasure, and I thank you all for everything that oh, hang on, there are a couple of messages I missed. Let me make sure. Oh yeah, Tanya's written more, and yeah. Okay, so yeah, I think we've pretty much covered everything. So yeah, thanks so much for coming, and stay in touch. I'll keep sending stuff out, and hopefully I'll get a chance to meet you people in person. That would be even better. But Zoom is a nice substitute for the moment.
All right, thanks Pat.
For coming.
Thanks for all.
Thanks, Pat. Nice to see everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.